The chamber stretched across a scale that defied human architecture, a vast hollow carved into orbiting stone and metal where the voices of empires gathered to speak. 1,000 banners shimmered with alien sigils, light bending to highlight their dominance. The assembly was ancient, every race present believing it was the pinnacle of order, yet an undercurrent of unease thickened the atmosphere. At the heart of this unease stood humanity, a species whose very presence disrupted centuries of hierarchy. Not long ago, humans had been regarded as a minor world confined to a single planet, a society unlikely to survive its own weapons. Yet in the span of decades, they had not only survived but carved their place into the void. Their ships traveled further than expected, their soldiers fought with terrifying efficiency, and their resilience made them impossible to dismiss. Whispers followed the delegation as they entered, subtle gestures rippling across the tiers of representatives. The insected envoys clicked nervously, the reptilian diplomats flexed claws against stone rails, and the avian choristers kept their tones low, unwilling to attract attention. The memory of human conflicts lingered in their minds. Where most species nearly extinguished themselves before reaching the stars, humans had danced on the edge of annihilation repeatedly, yet always pulled back at the last possible moment, stronger than before. This pattern terrified those who had studied them. To endure hardship was one thing, to thrive on it was something else entirely. The Peace Summit had been called after a series of confrontations along the outer colonies. Smaller powers had attempted to restrict humanity's expansion, assuming their fleets could intimidate. Instead, those fleets had returned shattered, their captains bewildered by the ferocity of human defense. The Council had rushed to prevent escalation, fearing humanity would retaliate with measures that might spiral beyond containment. Now the leaders gathered to place what they called a framework for stability, but what many recognized was little more than an attempt to chain a species that refused to bow. The human representatives sat silent at their station, their expressions unreadable, their posture controlled. No one could tell if they were insulted, amused, or indifferent. This silence unsettled more than any speech. Among species accustomed to shows of emotion, the stillness radiating from the humans resembled the pause before a predator's strike. Across the chamber, one could sense the unease turning into quiet dread. The aliens knew what they expected from humanity: desperation, gratitude, perhaps compliance. What they saw instead was composure, as though the humans had already anticipated every maneuver before stepping into the hall. The Council's opening remarks strained to sound cordial, but beneath the layers of ceremonial phrasing was the arrogance of ancient power addressing a newcomer. They spoke of responsibility, of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the need for structure within the greater good of the galaxy. To the other civilizations present, these words had long been accepted as truth. Yet in the presence of humans, each phrase carried a hollow echo. For the first time in centuries, there was a species unwilling to accept a hierarchy crafted long before it entered the stage. Historians present scribbled furiously, sensing that this gathering might mark a turning point. The galaxy had absorbed newcomers before, integrating them into its order, ensuring conformity. But none of those arrivals had faced the crucible humanity endured on its homeworld. None carried a history where survival depended on endless adaptation. None bore scars of wars that consumed continents yet failed to erase their drive. Humanity's history was its shield, and though unspoken, every leader present could see the weight of that shield resting invisibly at the negotiation table. Rumors had circulated in the weeks leading to the summit. Some claimed humans were developing fleets that could rival established powers, others whispered of weapons not yet catalogued. Traders spoke of human engineers who could dismantle and rebuild alien technology within days. Explorers described colonies thriving on worlds where no other species could endure. The whispers multiplied, feeding fear. Yet it was not the weapons or colonies that truly frightened the Council. It was the realization that humans seemed to need no permission, no guiding hand, no safety net. They carried an independence that threatened to unravel centuries of careful order. As the first statements concluded and the formality of diplomacy gave way to bargaining, all eyes returned to the humans. Their silence had become an unspoken force, commanding more attention than the speeches of empires older than human civilization itself. In that moment, Every leader present felt the weight of possibility. If humanity accepted the Council's terms, the balance might be preserved a little longer. If they resisted, if they defied the carefully woven structure, then the galaxy would face a future reshaped by a species that did not fear struggle but embraced it. The chamber was vast, the voices many, yet all of it seemed to hang on the quiet presence of those few human figures. The air itself carried anticipation, a silent recognition that the course of galactic history might pivot on what they chose to say, or chose not to say. And in that pause, a realization spread like cold fire. Humanity had already changed the game merely by arriving, and nothing the Council said could erase that truth. The voices of the elder empires filled the chamber with certainty born from ages of dominance. Each representative layered formality with veiled commands, presenting what they framed as an opportunity for humanity to secure its future. They spoke of integration into the wider order, of joining collective defense agreements, of curbing expansion to prevent instability. The tone was polished, but beneath the words lingered condescension, as though humanity were an unruly child in need of boundaries. To those watching, it was a familiar pattern. Whenever a rising power threatened balance, the Council smothered it under obligations dressed as diplomacy. The insected hierarchs emphasized resource quotas, insisting humanity must contribute without overreaching. The reptilian coalitions demanded monitoring of military assets, disguised as mutual transparency but designed to strip autonomy. The avian collectives sang in elegant harmony, offering membership in exchange for dissolving independent colonies into broader jurisdictions. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened, a future where Earth's voice would vanish under the weight of treaties, its authority reduced to ceremonial gestures, its people transformed from actors to subjects. Around the chamber, many species nodded approval, comforted by the familiar script. They believed order was being restored, that humans would accept the inevitability of their position. The young powers, still clawing for relevance, celebrated quietly, relieved they would not have to compete against such relentless rivals. Older powers hid their relief more carefully, but their satisfaction radiated in small gestures, tails flicking, frills expanding, wings folding with assurance. They assumed this was victory without conflict, a containment achieved through words rather than war. The human delegation remained silent, unbroken by the barrage of expectations. Their stillness created unease that no alien could name. Many species used motion, gestures, vocal tones, pheromones, to convey intent. In contrast, humanity gave nothing. No expression betrayed irritation, no sign revealed contemplation. The lack of reaction magnified the arrogance of the Council, for it allowed them to continue assuming their words held power. Yet beneath the surface, tension coiled. Observers could not tell if humans were weighing each insult, or dismissing them entirely. Those who studied human history knew the weight of this moment. Scholars had combed through archives of Earth's wars, revolutions, and negotiations. They knew humanity had faced demands before: colonial rule, economic strangulation, threats of annihilation. In each era, humans endured, then broke free with methods that defied prediction. What frightened the Council most was not the possibility of defiance, but the knowledge that defiance had always defined humanity's trajectory. What was offered now resembled cages forged of law and oath. To humans, cages had never been permanent. The rhetoric continued, embellished with promises of prosperity. They spoke of shared trade routes, cultural exchange, and protection under the aegis of galactic order. Yet the protective language carried sharp edges. Every offer was contingent upon surrendering sovereignty. Every pledge of cooperation concealed a leash. The elders expected gratitude. They anticipated relief, perhaps even admiration for being admitted to structures that predated human starfaring. Instead, their words fell into silence as deep as a void. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some began to notice the futility of speaking into the stillness. The Council's proposals, grand as they sounded, began to ring hollow. The more they listed conditions, the clearer it became that they did not seek peace but control. And though most could not articulate it, an instinct spread that humanity would not accept this path. The air seemed to tighten, heavy with an unspoken truth: the humans had not come to yield. For the first time, doubt touched even the most confident envoys. They recalled reports of human colonies thriving where others had failed, soldiers prevailing against overwhelming odds, explorers reaching regions deemed uninhabitable. They remembered that this was a species for whom every restriction became a challenge, every imposed boundary an invitation to resist. And still they pressed forward, too bound by their own traditions to alter course, too certain that words carried the weight of inevitability. The session drew toward its pause, the proposals fully displayed, the framework outlined. To the Council, it was a declaration of generosity; to humanity, it was a dismantling of everything they had fought to build. The chamber waited for acknowledgement, some sign that the delegation would finally respond. Yet all that came was silence, colder and heavier than before. And in that silence, the assembled powers felt a stirring of unease they had not expected when the talks began. The peace they envisioned hung fragile in the air, suspended on the assumption that humanity could be molded into compliance. But every passing moment of quiet made that assumption feel thinner, less certain, and far more dangerous than any had anticipated. The chamber held its breath as the silence stretched, every representative watching for the slightest flicker of response. When the human envoy finally spoke, the voice carried no anger, no haste, but a measured calm that struck harder than any outburst could have. Each word was delivered with precision, like a blade honed over centuries, cutting through the elaborate layers of the Council's rhetoric. There was no acknowledgement of gratitude, no sign of concession, only a dismantling of every demand laid before them. The envoy began by addressing the notion of disarmament. To strip humanity of its defenses, they said, was not peace but preparation for conquest. History had already shown them what followed disarmament, on Earth and beyond: oppression, subjugation, and the slow suffocation of freedom. They would not repeat mistakes written in blood across their own centuries. Humanity's fleets existed not as threats but as guarantees that no power, however ancient, could dictate their survival again. To ask otherwise was to ask them to surrender the very right to endure. Containment was confronted next, the claim that humanity must restrict itself within borders defined by others. The envoy's voice did not rise, but the weight of their words pressed on the chamber. Every expansion humanity had achieved, every colony carved from barren rock or hostile soil, had come at the cost of sacrifice. No species had given them territory; they had earned it with grit and ingenuity. To demand limits now was to erase the lives already laid down for each new foothold. The envoy declared that no wall drawn in distant chambers would ever confine a people who had learned, since their earliest days, to push beyond every horizon they saw. When the matter of integration surfaced, the response carried an even sharper edge. Integration, the envoy noted, was a polite word for assimilation, the dilution of identity until nothing unique remained. Humanity's history was filled with empires that sought to erase them, to bend them into a shape more convenient for the rulers of the time. They had endured them all, carrying forward with scars as reminders of resistance. To accept integration now, even dressed in gilded promises of prosperity, was to surrender the essence of what made them human. That price, the envoy said, could never be paid. The council shifted uneasily, their certainty unraveling as the envoy pressed further. They reminded the chamber that humanity had not asked for war, had not sought conquest, had not petitioned for inclusion under false terms. They had defended themselves when threatened, built when left alone, and survived when abandoned. The envoy's words drew a line through every assumption the council had clung to, that humans would fold under pressure, that they would bargain from weakness, that their hunger for recognition could be exploited. Instead, the refusal came with quiet authority, the authority of a species that had endured every trial hurled against it. As the speech unfolded, the weight of human history filled the chamber without being named directly. The envoy did not recount battles or boast of victories, yet those listening could feel the shadow of wars where humanity stood alone against overwhelming odds, disasters where extinction seemed inevitable, and the relentless march that always ended with survival. It was not spoken as threat, but as truth. Humanity's very existence was proof that no power in the galaxy could dictate their path. The final words landed with a clarity that silenced even the murmurs. "We did not come here to beg," We came here to see if you had learned. And you have not. The declaration was not shouted, not dramatized, but stated as fact. It cut deeper than defiance, it was judgment. The chamber erupted with disbelief, outrage, and confusion, yet all of it felt small against the calm finality of the human envoy's tone. For the first time, the council understood they were not negotiating with a junior power, but standing face to face with a species that refused to kneel. What followed was not a debate but a collapse of certainty. Representatives shouted, demanding reconsideration, warning of consequences, insisting humanity could not be allowed to choose its own course. Yet beneath their noise, one truth lingered, sharp and undeniable: the humans had spoken, and there would be no compromise. The uproar thundered across the chamber, a cascade of voices colliding in desperation to reassert control, yet none of it reached the human delegation. They rose in unison, their movements measured, deliberate, and utterly silent. No declaration accompanied the act, no glance spared for those who shouted after them. The simple act of standing, of pushing back their chairs and turning away from the chamber, carried a gravity that no speech could equal. It was the refusal embodied in motion, the rejection of an entire order by the very species the council had tried to cage with words. The silence that followed their first step was more piercing than the chaos that preceded it. Leaders accustomed to dominance froze, watching a delegation of newcomers walk away from centuries of established authority, as if it meant nothing. Each stride was deliberate, echoing with finality. For a body built on ritual and symbolism, the gesture was devastating. Words could be debated, amended, rephrased. Walking away could not. It was the ultimate statement, irreversible and absolute. A ripple of unease spread through the chamber. Some envoys shouted warnings of sanctions, others threatened retaliation, their voices cracking with a panic they could not hide. A few pleaded for reconsideration, desperate to preserve the illusion of control. But none of it mattered. The humans neither slowed nor responded. Their silence mocked every attempt to reclaim authority, as though the council's voices had been stripped of relevance. The sight alone redefined power in that chamber more effectively than any weapon could have. Among the elder empires, fear settled heavily. They recognized what others did not yet grasp: that power was not merely fleets or armies, but the will to walk away from a table designed to bind. The council had ruled for centuries on the assumption that no species dared to defy its authority openly. Yet here was humanity, not with fleets arrayed in orbit, not with threats or ultimatums, but with the audacity to deny the very premise of the council's control. It was an act more destabilizing than open war, because it declared that the order itself held no weight over them. The younger powers, watching from the side galleries, felt an entirely different shock. For generations they had bent under the weight of treaties and obligations, too weak to resist, too fearful to challenge. Seeing humanity reject all of it without hesitation cracked something open in their minds. Possibility replaced resignation, and that possibility was dangerous. If humans could do this and survive, perhaps others could follow. The council's authority, once considered immovable, suddenly looked fragile, and fragility invited rebellion. The walkout unfolded slowly, each step magnified by the silence that spread wider with every passing moment. The humans' departure became a performance none could turn away from. The delegation did not once break formation, did not once betray haste, as if time itself bent to their decision. To many observers, it felt as though the galaxy's center of gravity had shifted. Authority no longer radiated from the council's high tiers. It trailed behind those figures as they left the hall. Attempts to reframe the moment as arrogance or madness rang hollow even as they were spoken. Deep down, every envoy present knew they had witnessed something irrevocable. Threats would no longer intimidate a species that had stared down extinction countless times and chosen to endure. Promises would no longer entice a people who had carved their survival from hostile worlds without assistance. What remained was the certainty that humanity's path would no longer intersect with the structures the council imposed. When the great doors sealed behind them, the sound reverberated like a closing epic. The chamber that had so often celebrated its power now felt diminished, its grandeur mocked by absence. The walkout was not merely an exit but an erasure of legitimacy, a declaration that the Council's voice no longer commanded the galaxy's full obedience. What remained in its place was silence, heavy and accusing, reminding every observer that they had failed to keep humanity bound. The Council, for all its centuries of dominance, had just witnessed its greatest humiliation. Humanity had not threatened, had not fought, had not raised a hand in violence. They had simply walked away. And in doing so, they had carved a wound deeper than any battle could inflict. Shock lingered long after the humans had vanished, their absence heavier than their presence had ever been. The chamber seethed with noise, but beneath it ran a current of dread no voice could conceal. What had been dismissed as arrogance now revealed itself as something far more dangerous, a refusal that no treaty, no sanction, no combined fleet could undo. The galaxy had built its order on the assumption that all powers eventually bent, if not by choice then by force. Humanity had just proven otherwise, and the implications spread like cracks in glass. The elder empires conferred in hushed tones, their confidence rattled. To them, the walkout was not simply insult, it was exposure. Every system of control, every intricate web of treaties and enforcement, had depended on universal acceptance of the Council's primacy. If one species could walk away without consequence, the illusion of inevitability dissolved. Their authority had never been tested in such a visible, irrevocable way. The silence of human defiance had pierced through centuries of carefully maintained dominance. Now they scrambled, debating whether to respond with punishment, or to ignore the insult and risk looking powerless. Across the lesser delegations, whispers grew bolder. Races long suppressed by regulations and quotas felt the tremor of possibility. If humanity could ignore decrees, perhaps they too could question the chains around their own futures. What had once been whispered in private now rippled through public thought. The Council was not immortal, and its order was not unbreakable. For species that had endured generations of subjugation, humanity's walkout was more than defiance. It was inspiration, a signal flare showing that the impossible could be done. The military strategists among the powers felt fear in sharper form. They had seen the reports of human fleets moving with efficiency that belied their youth, their soldiers adapting to alien tactics with unnerving speed, their colonies thriving where seasoned empires had failed. To imagine that such a species would now act beyond restraint chilled them. For centuries, the Council's structure had prevented escalation by binding every power to its laws. But humans were no longer bound. Unpredictable, relentless, they would act without permission, and no one could foresee the consequences. In their calculations, restraint was no longer guaranteed. Traders and industrialists considered the fallout differently. They knew humanity's hunger for resources, their ability to invent under pressure, their drive to seize opportunity wherever it appeared. Exclusion from the Council's order would not slow them, it would force them to innovate faster. Already rumors spread of shipyards working day and night, of research stations on the edge of map space testing technologies the Council had forbidden. Every restriction lifted became a catalyst. Isolation would not weaken humanity, it would sharpen them into something no empire could easily rival. Fear gave way to argument, each faction desperate to frame the future. Some demanded an immediate show of strength, insisting fleets must be dispatched to remind humans of consequences. Others urged caution, warning that a war might ignite what they least desired, a demonstration of humanity's capacity to endure and retaliate beyond reason. A few argued for reconciliation, but their words faltered, for no envoy could imagine what concession might lure humans back. Once dignity is thrown aside, no bargain can restore it. In the outer halls, the delegates who had once mocked humanity now spoke in hushed dread. They recalled human history as it had been studied, their endless conflicts, their capacity to rebuild from ruin. They whispered of a species that treated every catastrophe as a lesson, every hardship as fuel. The thought spread that the walkout was not an end but a beginning, a signal that humanity would chart a path of its own making, no matter how many barriers were thrown before them. The fear was not that humans had left the chamber, but that they had left behind the need for anyone's approval. Reports began to flow in from the edges of known space. Colonies expanding at accelerated rates. Fleets mobilizing not for conquest but for preparation. industries surging with an intensity that alarmed those who tracked such things. Even the simplest observer could see the pattern. Humanity had shifted into motion, not slowed by the Council's rejection but energized by it. Where others saw insult, humans seemed to see opportunity, and that alone terrified the powers that had sought to contain them. The chamber eventually quieted, though the silence that followed was heavier than the arguments that preceded it. Each delegation departed with its own fears, its own calculations, its own whispered acknowledgments of failure. Yet one truth bound them all. Humanity had not walked away from peace. They had walked toward their own future, carrying with them the certainty that no one could dictate the limits of their ambition. The Council had watched in horror, and the galaxy would live with the consequences.